Hello everyone. We are discussing the book The Changing Role of International Organizations, the League and the United Nations 1919-2011, which is part of the breadth studies of Edexcel International GCSE history. So we have covered Unit 1 and Unit 2 in our previous lessons, and in this lesson we are going to focus on Unit 3, which is setting up the United Nations organization and its work till 1964. Our learning objectives are: number 1, to understand the structure of the United Nations; number 2, to understand the structural problems of the United Nations; number 3, to evaluate the performance of the United Nations in Palestine, Korea, and the Congo. From the League of Nations to the United Nations. So as we know, League of Nations was established after the First World War, and it set up the international relations of the interwar period between the First World War and Second World War. The League of Nations had many positive positive works that has been done to make the world better. However, as the Second World War started, League of Nations failed to prevent the international crisis, and therefore in 1945 the countries thought of some other better version of the League of Nations, and they came up with the United Nations. United Nations is still an active universal organization, and it is still functioning, and the countries are actively involved in different UN work. So, we are talking about the UN structure. First of all, with the flashback, we can say that in 1941, when USA was attacked by the Japanese in the Pearl Harbor, USA joined the Second World War, and Roosevelt and Churchill, the Prime Minister of the UK, they met and they discussed what to do about the future, how to fight together, the cooperation. And there they came up with the idea of the United Nations. Then in 1943, there is this Moscow Declaration by the USA, USSR, China, and Great Britain that they agreed to replace the League of Nations with another universal organization. As you can see again, this is 2 years before the Second World War ended. And then in 1945, finally, when the war was over, the United Nations organization was set up, was founded in San Francisco Conference. When the UN was officially founded in San Francisco Conference, 50 nations signed its charter. And till now, the numbers have been only increasing. Today, almost all of the countries are the members of the United Nations. So, what is UN Charter? UN Charter is a kind of like a constitution of the main constitution of the organization. If you remember, the League of Nations had its own covenant, and UN has its own charter, but basically it's the same thing. So it's the setting up all the aims, rules, structure of the organization. United Nations Charter states that there are aims reflected. Number 1, preventing war and maintaining international peace and security. Number 2, promoting human rights. Number 3, solving problems through international law and cooperation. And number 4 is promoting a better quality of life for all peoples. Now, if you can compare, try to recall the aims of the League of Nations and try to compare the aims of League of Nations with the aims of United Nations. As you can see, both are discouraging the aggression and encouraging the cooperation between the countries. The United Nations, at the beginning, when it was just set up in 1945, had the following organizational structure. As you can see, at the top is Secretariat, and remember to compare it to League of Nations. League of Nations also had the Secretariat. Security Council. In the League of Nations, it was called just the Council. International Court of Justice. Trusteeship Council, Economic and Social Council, and General Assembly. So remember, there are 6 bodies of the United Nations, and please remember them. All right, now this is the modern United Nations, as opposed to the previous slide. Here you can see the Security Council in details. There are 5 permanent members of the Security Council. You can see from the flags that this is China, Russia, France, USA, and United Kingdom. And then there are 10 non-permanent members elected for 2-year terms. We'll talk about it. Economic and Social Council is very active and still up to work. International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, and then there are a lot of UN organs which are doing incredible job right now, helping different spheres of life, different countries. This is UNDP, Development Plan, UNHCR, UNICEF, UNEP, specialized agencies, FAO, UNESCO, World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, etc., etc. So, what is the difference between the initial and current structure of the UN? Think about it. What is the difference between the initial and current structure of the UN? I'll go back in slides. This is the initial structure of the United Nations, and this is the current structure of United Nations. Think about it. And let's go on to the next slide. All right. Who do you think those people are? As you can see, they are the Secretaries General of the United Nations from 1945 till 2016. These people have made enormous change and have contributed to the international relations during the Cold War and during the post-Cold War period. Now, Secretary General of the United Nations. So, this person is the head of the United Nations Secretariat. The Secretary General serves as the Chief Administrative Officer of the United Nations. He's the face of United Nations. The Secretary General is appointed by the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council. Usually, Secretary Generals are compromise candidates from middle powers and have little prior frame. I'll go back. Please have a look at those pictures. Look at the countries they are representing and tell me what is different about it. Please have a look at the countries that these people are from. South Korea, Egypt, Austria, Myanmar, Peru, Sweden, Norway. Which countries don't you see there? Ask yourself a question. Now, if you look at it, the superpowers, USSR, USA, or Russia and USA at the moment, China, United Kingdom, France, are absent. So we have never had secretary generals from these countries. Let's move on. Secretariat. It carries out day-to-day work of the United Nations. It is led by the Secretary General. Secretariat puts the UN decisions into action, and around 16,000 employees and volunteers work at the United Nations offices around the world. Okay, we go to General Assembly. All UN members sit in the General Assembly. Every country has one representative. General Assembly usually meets once a year, sometimes more than once if there is an emergency situation. General Assembly elects non-permanent members of the Security Council. General Assembly votes for International Court of Justice judges. It appoints the Secretary General. Of course, we saw in the previous slide that it is the candidate is recommended by the Security Council, but General Assembly votes for who will be the Secretary General. In General Assembly, every country has just one vote. Recommendations need a 2/3 majority to pass. Let's look at the Security Council. Security Council is a limited club. It has only 15 members, out of which 5 members are permanent. China, France, Great Britain, Russia, in the times of Cold War it was Soviet Union, and the United States of America. Now, if you compare it to the League of Nations permanent members in the Council, if you remember, it was Britain, France, Japan, and Italy. As you can see, these permanent members are decided by the times, by the it is also called the Winners' Club. After the Second World War, which countries came as victors? Think about this. Also, pay attention to the fact that all 5 countries, all 5 permanent members of the Security Council, they have nuclear weapons. Now, non-permanent members, there are 10 of them from different countries, and countries are usually elected for 2-year terms. Security Council is responsible for maintaining international peace and security. Security Council enforces sanctions. It authorizes the use of force to maintain or restore international peace and security. Permanent members have right to veto, to block any decision. Decisions are binding on UN members. Now, one of the organs of the United Nations that is paralyzed today, so officially it exists, but it really doesn't do any work at the moment because there's no need for it. It's Trusteeship Council. So it replaces the Mandates Commission of the League of Nations. So as you can see, its aim is to make sure that the world decolonizes and that the countries become independent and perfectly capable of ruling themselves. And since 1994, when the last land called Palau became independent, there was no need for this council anymore. So its work is paralyzed. Economic and Social Council, there are 54 members elected for 3-year terms, so countries change. Develops and implements social, economic, and environmental policies, oversees and monitors the UN's 5 regional development commissions, sustainable development, and human rights. So generally speaking, Economic and Social Council, it's the huge humanitarian, social, economic work that UN has been doing for so many years, and although it may not always be successful, but at least this is the contribution to universal welfare of all the countries. So this council is really doing the tough job. The International Court of Justice, it sits at The Hague. It replaced the League's permanent International Court of Justice. There are 15 judges elected for 9-year terms by the Security Council and General Assembly. It settles disputes between the countries, but of course, if the countries ask the International Court of Justice to help them sort out their problems. Let's look at the subsidiary bodies that United Nations have. As you can see, there are commissions: Disarmament Commission, Human Rights Council, Military Staff Committee, Counterterrorism, Peace Building, and many, many more. I will ask each and every student of mine to pick one of the funds, programs, special commissions, or any specialized agencies and do a research on them, and then please submit it via email to me. So as you can see, for example, UNICEF is working for the welfare of children, and then there's UN Women. Obviously, it's working for gender equality and the problems that women face in nowadays and empowerment of the woman. Then there is UNAIDS, which is part of the health program, which is fighting against HIV/AIDS. Then there is, for example, FAO, it's Food and Agriculture Organization. You can look at UNESCO, which is, it's global. It's about culture, science, education. World Health Organization, WHO. At the moment, World Health Organization is in the news because of the coronavirus, and they've been doing so much work on researching the vaccinations, um, uh, informing the countries about quarantine and the necessity of protecting the population. So World Health Organization is right now in the limelight. The structural problems of the UN. No, so let's summarize. Now we know the structure of the United Nations. So if you would get a question, like for example, what are the two features of the structure of United Nations, you would be able to answer about different parts of United Nations, aims of United Nations, and now we are looking at what the problems are with the United Nations. And for example, one of the problems, it occurs in Security Council. So, as we know, United Nations was set up in 1945, but we are now in 2020. So the world has changed and evolved. UN Security Council doesn't reflect the changes. Emerging powers such as India, Brazil, and other countries are not permanent members, and the very existence of five permanent members, it's kind of demotivating the other countries. The other countries are arguing that why Britain and France and USA and Russia and China have to be permanent members. The other countries also should have a word to say. And one of the biggest problems in the Security Council is the veto, blocking the decision by the permanent members. So during the Cold War, when, as you know, the world was polarized between USSR and USA, and the countries were taking either side, the national interest, due to national interest, the cooperation between the five permanent members was impossible. So, for example, if the conflict and that was being discussed in the Security Council was not in favor of national interests of Soviet Union would block the decision. Or if it was USA who had a problem, the problem contradicted the national interests of USA, then they would veto the decision. Any proposal was weighed for or against the national interests of the USA or USSR. For example, let's look at the statistics. 1946-1991, that's the time of the Cold War. 114 vetoes by USSR and 96 vetoes by the USA. 1945 till 1985, 13 peacekeeping operations as opposed to 36 between 1988 and 2015. So that means that only 13 operations were realized by the United Nations peacekeeping operations, which probably helped to solve conflicts around the world. But then, after the Cold War, it increased to 36. It increased twice. So that means that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world was different. Although it doesn't exclude the fact that today Russia has taken over the role of the Soviet Union, and they still have conflicting, clashing interests between USA and Russia. This is the cartoon. Please have a look at this cartoon. I'll give you a few minutes, a few seconds to actually look at the cartoon. And yeah, so the cartoon is from 2008, and it illustrates the Cold War, the national interests of the permanent five. It is about condemning Burma's human rights record. So what has been happening in Burma. And if you look at it, France, the first person from the left is France. So they say there's no economic interest there. Go ahead. So because it is not against French interests, so they are fine. So they vote yes. And then who is the second person? Guess who's saying it's an internal affair as Chechnya? No way. Who does it look like? This is Russia. So, and Russia is saying that let's not intervene, it's internal affairs of Burma, because Russia knows that it can be compared to its own internal affairs because in Chechnya there were so many human rights violations. Um, let's look at the third, fourth, fifth people. Try to guess who they are. Permanent five, remember? So who's the third person? Okay, who is saying Condoleezza has told me there isn't petroleum there, so do what you want. This is USA. So USA is trying to say that it does not clash with our national interests. So uh, go on and send the peacekeeping operation. And then we've got China, who's saying no, they are my friends. How dare you? So there you go. There's a veto, and it will block the whole decision because China apparently is so it is clashing with the interests of China. And then Britain says it depends. What does Bush do? This is mocking the United Kingdom politics for always agreeing with USA and having the same politics. Now let's look at Security Council and China. As you know, after the long civil war, China had long civil wars starting from 1930s, lasting till 1949. China was split up into two countries: People's Republic of China, which is mainland China, and Taiwan, which is Republic of China. Now, because the United Nations was set up in 1945, and at the time there was only one nationalist government of China, China was represented in the United Nations Security Council. So, USSR and People's Republic of China, starting from 1949, when PRC was established, they were unhappy about it. They wanted PRC, People's Republic of China, the Communist China, to be represented in the Security Council of the United Nations. This lasted quite a while. Only in 1971, PRC replaced Taiwan as the permanent member in the Security Council, and that was only due to the detente, the times when the relationship between China and USSR was worsening, and the relationship between USA and China was improving. So USA believed that China would no longer necessarily side with the USSR. Only then they allowed PRC to be represented in the Security Council. The structural problems of the United Nations General Assembly. So we talked about Security Council. Now let's look at the General Assembly. Between 1945 and 1955, the USSR was against more countries joining the United Nations. They didn't want countries to come because they were afraid or concerned that more countries would side up with the Western world, with the capitalist world, because the realities of the world after 1945 was that Cold War was increasing and globalizing. The situation only changed in 1960 with many African countries becoming independent. It was even called the Year of Africa. Um, Less economically developed countries also joined United Nations. And this changed the balance of power in the General Assembly away from Europe. General Assembly must obey decisions taken by the Security Council even if these decisions contradict their views. And that is one of the weaknesses, one of the problems. Because as you know, Security Council, when they make a decision, usually it's for the national interests of one of the five permanent members. So General Assembly General Assembly members, all the countries in the General Assembly have to agree with Security Council. General Assembly chooses the non-permanent members of the Security Council, thus having some influence, but that is not much. Let's look at UN peacekeeping forces. The UN does not have its own military forces due to the Cold War tensions. If you remember, League of Nations had the same problem. They had the collective security. They wanted to have their own military forces, but then eventually countries didn't agree. The same happened with United Nations. Instead, in accordance with the United Nations Charter, they talked about collective action to deal with any threats to international peace and security. So, There is United Nations Military Staff Committee, which is meeting every 2 weeks. All countries can supply military personnel for peacekeeping missions, but permanent five have the biggest contribution. They have the biggest weight. Once the missions are finished, the forces have to be disbanded and go home. Sometimes the military staff committee works with NATO or other military organizations. There's a problem. United Nations' ability to react swiftly to a crisis is limited, just like in the League of Nations, if you remember. United Nations peacekeeping forces arrive only after the conflicts start. They do not prevent the conflicts. They come to freeze the conflict and help the population not to be destroyed by the conflicting sides. And there's relatively new body of the United Nations. It's called Human Rights Council. Um, Although the Declaration of the Human Rights, United Nations Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948. One of the authors was Eleanor Roosevelt, who you can see on the cover of the IGCSE history book. Generally, Human Rights Council was actively being involved after the Cold War ended. So, Human Rights Council is led by UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. UNHRC promotes and encourages respect for human rights for all. It identifies, researches, and monitors human rights abuses, provides assistance to governments. Especially after the genocides in Bosnia and Rwanda, the UNHCR Council became very active. This is 1990s and onwards. In 2005, UN members agreed that the international community should take action where governments fail to protect its own people. These are the organizations that work within the United Nations system, for example, International Labour Organization, UN Human Rights Council, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, Food and Agriculture Organization, World Health Organization, UN International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, UNESCO, Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. So what I would like you to do, 9H students, please choose one of these organizations, research about it and submit the paper to me via email about your research. And another homework task for you is the exam style question. How far did the setup and role of the United Nations differ from that of the League of Nations? So you are comparing League of Nations from Unit 1 and 2 to United Nations. You may use the following in your answer. The roles of Secretary Generals in the League of Nations and in the United Nations. The peacekeeping forces, compare what League of Nations has done and what United Nations has done, and you can add your own information. So I will be waiting for this homework task, this 16 marks worth essay question. Please submit it via email as well. I will be waiting for these. I will soon post it on Open School so you can have an access. Thank you very much. See you in the next lesson.